Voice and Phenomenon by Jacques Derrida, translated from the French by Leonard Lawlor, read by Jacob Flanagan. Chapter 7, The Originative Supplement. Thus understood, supplementarity is really difference, the operation of differing that at once splits and delays presence, subjecting it by the same action to originary division and originary delay. Difference is thought prior to the separation between deferral, differe, as delay, and differing, differe, as the active work of difference. It must be understood that difference is unthinkable starting from consciousness, that is, starting from presence, or starting simply from opposite of presence, absence, or non-consciousness. It is also unthinkable as simple homogeneous, a complication of a diagram or a line of time, as complex succession. Supplementary difference vicariates for presence in its originary lack in regard to itself. We must now verify, going through the first logical investigation, in what way these concepts respect the relation between the sign in general, indicative as much as expressive, and presence in general. Going through Husserl's text, that is, reading that can simply be neither that of commentary nor that of interpretation. Let us first note that this concept of originary supplementarity is not only implies the non-fullness of presence, or in Husserl's language, the non-fulfillment of an intuition, but it also designates this function of substitutive supplementing in general. The structure of the in the place of, for etwas, that also belongs to every sign in general, and about which at the beginning we were astonished that Husserl subjected the possibility of this structure to no critical question, taking its possibility for granted when he distinguished between the indicative sign and the expressive sign. What we would like to finally start thinking about is the fact that the for itself of self-presence, the Spursik, traditionally determined in its dative dimension as phenomenological, reflective, or pre-reflective autodonation, arises in the movement of supplementarity as originary substitution in the form of in the place of, for etwas, that is, as we have seen in the very operation of signification in general. The for itself would be an in itself put for itself in the place of itself. The strange structure of the supplement appears here. A possibility produces by delay that to which it is said to be added. This structure of supplementarity is very complicated. Insofar as it is a supplement, the signifier does not first represent merely the absence signified. It substitutes itself for another signifier, for another signifying order, which carries on another relation with the missing presence, an other relation that is more valuable owing to the play of difference. It is more valuable since the play of difference is the movement of idealization, and because the more the signifier is ideal, the more it augments the potency of repetition of presence. The more it protects, reserves, and capitalizes on sense. In this way, the indication is not only the substitute that supplements the absence of or the invisibility of the indicated, as we remember, is always an existent. The indication also replaces another type of signifier, the expressive sign. That is, a signifier whose signified, the Bedeutung, is ideal. In fact, in real communicative, etc. discourse, expression yields its place to indication because, as we recall, the sense intended by another and in a general way the lived experience of another are not and can never be present in person. This is why, as Husserl says, expression then function as indication. We still need to know, and this is most important, in what way expression itself implies in its structure a non-fullness. Expression is known, however, as being fuller than indication, since the appresentational detour is no longer necessary to it, and because it could not function as such in the alleged self-present of the solitary discourse. In fact, it is indeed important to the measure of what distance, at what articulated distance, an intuitionistic theory of knowledge governs Husserl's concept of language. The entire originality of this concept depends on the fact that its final subjection to intuitionism does not oppress what we could call the freedom of language, the outspokenness of a discourse, even if it is false and contradictory. One is able to speak without knowing, against the entire philosophical tradition. Husserl demonstrates that speech, then, is still fully legitimate speech, provided that it is obedient to certain rules which are not immediately given as rules of knowledge. Pure logical grammar, the pure morphology of significations, must tell us a priori under what conditions a discourse can be a discourse, even if it makes no knowledge possible. We must here consider the final exclusion or reduction to which Husserl brings us in order to isolate the specific purity of expression. This is his most audacious exclusion. It consists in putting out of play as unessential components of expression the acts of intuitive knowledge that fulfill the meaning, vouloir dire. We know that the act of meaning, the one that gives the Bedeutung, Bedeutungsintention, is always the aim of a relation to the object. But it is enough that this intention animates the body of a signifier for that discourse to take place. The fulfillment of the intention by an intention is not indispensable. It belongs to the original structure of expression to be able to do without the full presence of the object aimed at in intuition. Evoking once more the confusion which is born from the entanglement, Verflechtung, of relations, Husserl writes in section 9, quote, "If we seek to plant ourselves firmly in the soil of pure description, the concrete phenomena of expression, animated with a sense, sine belebten, is articulated on the one hand into a physical phenomenon in which the expression is constituted according to its physical side, and on the other hand into acts which endow it with the Bedeutung contingently intuitive fullness in which the relation to the expressed objective correlate is constituted. Thanks to these acts, expression is more than a simple flatus voci. Vocis? It intends something, and insofar as expression intends something, it is related to something objective." Unquote. Fullness is therefore merely contingent. The absence of the intended object does not compromise the meaning. The absence does not reduce the expression to its unanimated and in itself meaningless physical side. Husserl writes, quote, "The objective something to which the intention relates itself can or indeed does appear as actually present, actual gegenwärtig, thanks to the accompanying or at least represented vergegenwärtig intuitions, for example, as in an imaginary form. In the case where that has taken place, the relation to the objective correlate is realized. Or else, when this is not the case, the expression functions with its charge of sense. Fungiert sinnvoll. It is always more than a simple flatus vocis, even although it is deprived of the intuition that founds it, which provides it with an object." Unquote. The fulfilling intuition is therefore essential to the expression, to the intention of the meaning. The rest of this chapter is devoted to accumulating proofs of this difference between intention and intuition. Since all classical theories of language have been blind to the difference, they have been unable to avoid aporias and absurdities. These Husserl marks out as he proceeds, over the course of subtle and decisive analyses that we are unable to follow here. The demonstration is given of the ideality of the Bedeutung and of the non-coincidence between the expression, the Bedeutung, both insofar as they are ideal unities, and the object. Two identical expressions can have the same Bedeutung, meaning the same thing, and yet have a different object. For example, in the two propositions, Bucephalus is a horse, and this steed is a horse, two different expressions are able to have the same Bedeutungen, but intend the same object. For example, in the two expressions, the victor at Jena and the vanquished at Waterloo, finally, two different expressions are able to have the same Bedeutung and the same object. Londres, London, zwei, two, duo, etc. Without such distinctions, no pure logical grammar would be possible. Consequently, the pure morphology of judgments whose possibility supports the entire structure of formal and transcendental logic would be forbidden. In fact, we know that pure logical grammar depends entirely on the distinction between Widersinnigkeit and Sinnlosigkeit. If it is obedient to certain rules, an expression can be widersinnig, contradictory, false, absurd, according to a certain type of absurdity, while still having an intelligible false sense that allows a normal discourse to take place, without becoming nonsense, Unsinn. It can have no possible object for empirical reasons, a golden mountain, or for a priori reasons, a square circle, while still having an intelligible sense, without being sinnlos. The absence of the object, Gegenstandlosigkeit, is not therefore the absence of meaning, Bedeutungslosigkeit. Pure logical grammar, therefore, excludes from the normalcy of discourse only nonsense in the sense of Unsinn, or abracadabra, vert eu, green is who. If we were not able to understand what square circle or golden mountain means, how could we come to a conclusion about the absence of a possible object? In Unsinn, in the agrammaticality of nonsense, the minimum of understanding is denied to us. Following the logic and necessity of these distinctions, we might be tempted to support the idea not only that meaning does not essentially imply the intuition of the object, but also that it essentially excludes the intuition. The structural originality of the meaning would be Gegenstandlosigkeit, the absence of the object given to intuition, the fullness of the presence that comes to fulfill the aim of meaning. Intuition and intention fuse into one another. They form a unity of intimate merging, eine innige Verschmolzen Einheit, that has an originary character. This is to say that language that speaks in the presence of its object erases or lets its own originality dissolve. It erases the structure that belongs only to it and allows it to function all alone when its intention is severed from intuition. Here, instead of suspecting that Husserl begins the analysis with its dissociation too soon, we might wonder if he is not unifying too much and too soon. Is it not excluded for essential and structural reasons, very reasons that Husserl recalls, that the unity of intuition and intention are ever homogeneous and that the meaning fuses into intuition without disappearing? Is it not the case that we will never in principle be able in expression to honor the draft drawn in intuition? Here taking up Husserl's language. Let us consider the extreme case of a statement about perception. Let us suppose it is produced in the very moment of perceptual intuition. I say, I see now a particular person by the window at the moment I actually see that person. What is implied structurally in what I am doing is that the content of this expression is ideal and that its unity is not impaired by the absence of the hic et nunc perception. The one who is next to me, or at an infinite distance in time and space, hears this proposition must, in principle, understand what I intend to say. Since this possibility is the possibility of discourse, it must structure the very act of the one who speaks, while perceiving. My non-perception, my non-intuition, my hic et nunc absence are said by what I say, what I mean, and because I say it. Never will the structure be able to make with intuition a unity of intimate emerging. The absence of intuition, and therefore of the subject of the intuition, is not only tolerated by the discourse, the absence is required by the structure of signification in general, were one to consider it in itself. The absence is radically required, the total absence of the subject and of the object of the statement, the death of the writer and or the disappearance of the objects that he has been able to describe, does not prevent a text from meaning, vouloir dire. On the contrary, this possibility gives birth to meaning, vouloir dire. As such, hands it over to being heard or read. Let us go further. In what way is writing, the common name for the signs that function despite the total absence of the subject, means of and beyond his death, implied in the very movement of signification in general, in particular in speech what is called live? In what way does writing inaugurate and complete idealization, being itself neither real nor ideal? Finally, in what way are death, idealization, repetition, and signification thinkable in their pure possibility, only on the basis of one and the same openness? This time, let us take the example of the personal pronoun I. Husserl classifies it among the expressions that are essentially occasional. It shares this characteristic with a whole group presenting a conceptual unity of possible Bedeutungen, such that it is essential for this expression to orient its actual Bedeutung each time to the occasion, to the person who is speaking, or his situation. This group is distinguished at once from the group of expressions whose plurivocity is contingent and reducible by means of a convention. The word rule, for example, means both a wooden instrument and a prescription. And from the group of objective expressions, whose univocity, the discursive circumstances, context, and situation of the speaking subject do not affect. For example, all the expressions in theory, expressions out of which the principles and theorems, the proofs and theories of the abstract sciences are made up. The mathematical expression is the model for this group. Only these objective expressions are absolutely pure of indicative contamination. We are able to recognize an essentially occasional expression by means of the fact that we cannot, in principle, replace it in the discourse by a permanent objective conceptual representation, without distorting the Bedeutung of the statement. If, for example, I tried to substitute for the word I, such as it appears in a statement, with what I believe to be its objective conceptual content, whatever person who, while speaking, is designating himself, I would end up in absurdities. Instead of I am pleased, I would have whatever person, while speaking, is designating himself as pleased. Each time that such a substitution distorts the statement, we are dealing with an essentially subjective and occasional expression whose function remains indicative. Thus, indication penetrates wherever a reference in the discourse to the situation of the subject does not let itself be reduced, wherever the situation of the subject lets itself be indicated by a personal pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun, or a subjective adverb of the following type: here, there, above, below, now, yesterday, tomorrow, before, after, etc. This massive return of indication into expression forces Husserl to conclude, quote, "An essentially indicating character naturally spreads to all expressions which include these and similar representations as parts. This includes all the multiple forms of discourse where the speaker gives normal expressions to something concerning himself or which is thought of in relation to himself. All expressions for perceptions, convictions, doubts, wishes, fears, commands belong here." Unquote.